If you like Gandalf, wizards, or you just want to sling some of Magic's biggest, most powerful spells for free, then you, my friend, are in the right place. I absolutely love the works of Tolkien. I love Middle-earth, and similar to many, I love Gandalf as a character. And it's mostly because of Gandalf that I very quickly as a child built up a love for wizards and have a big soft spot for the wizard creature type in Magic. Cards like Meddling Mage and Arcanist the Omnipotent definitely kicked this off in a big way when I first got into the game. But despite that, I have never built a wizard deck in Commander. Now don't get me wrong, I desperately wanted to make a wizard deck, helmed by Gandalf when the Lord of the Rings set came out, but none of the Gandalf cards were designed in a way that they supported an entire deck being built around them, especially a wizard-related deck in a way that excited me. That's partly why I ended up building the Sauron deck that many of you have also gone on to build and love. But this Gandalf deck is the one that I've wanted to build for a very long time, and it turned out way more spicy than I anticipated when I started cooking it up. So stick around to learn how I think, build, and of course, the end results for Gandalf the Party Guest. Now in case you haven't already seen Gandalf, he is a Jeskai 3/4 avatar wizard for 4 mana. More importantly, his ability is that at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value X or less from your hand without paying its mana cost, where X is twice the number of legendary wizards that you control. Because of the way that Gandalf's ability works, this deck will want to do 2 things. Firstly, it'll want to resolve his ability as many times as it can, and then it'll want to play spells that are as powerful as possible. Naturally, a game that goes long is in Gandalf's favor. So initially I leaned towards this being a bracket 2 deck, but depending how explosive his ability ends up being, the deck may well end up being bracket 3, but I guess that we'll find out together which of those it is. Now whenever I see a commander that I'm excited about, I start thinking about the types of things that the deck may want to do, or what kinds of cards or effects I know of that would fit well. Typically a deck can do about 5 to 6 things well, based on how much space that we have for the cards in our deck. To make this deck work, we obviously need a bunch of legendary wizards, and we'll probably want at least a third of our non-land cards to be creatures. If there's anything I love almost as much as wizards, it's cheating in reduced cost spells in Magic, so we want a bunch of high value instants and sorceries that are at least 4 mana and above. What these spells will actually do, we'll need to figure out, but this will likely be the most dopamine inducing part of our deck. The best parts of any deck are the parts that end up feeling a little bit illegal, and playing free spells definitely fits the bill here. So we'll need to figure out how to make those free spells even more broken. My mind goes into translating that free spell or those free spells into other major advantages. Things like drawing tons of cards or creating serious combat threats. This idea of turning the free spell into a larger burst of resources or a trade for another type of value, like instead casting spells from our graveyard, is what's going to make this deck absolutely cook, and I look forward to showing you some of the very broken things that this deck can do shortly. Now the flashy high dopamine stuff aside, we will still want to make sure that we're eating our vegetables, and that means a bunch of protection for our wizards, and a bunch of interaction or removal to make sure that we don't get player removed. Something I really like is that whereas in other decks, these types of cards feel purely functional, in a wizard deck they will feel highly thematic. Let's look at how I built the deck. Now to be honest, when I first started building, I was actually pretty sad, because I accidentally forgot to exclude non-legendary wizards, and there were tons of cool wizards like Meddling Mage, Snapcaster Mage, or Polywog Prodigy that weren't legendary. But slowly but surely I found plenty of legendary wizards that made me very excited about this deck as it came together. From wizards like Adeliz and Belmore that can pump our wizards to give us better win conditions, to the Emperor of Palamecia that can become a game-ending burn threat, to wizards like Krill that can bring our wizards back from the grave. We'll come back to the wizards in a second, because I got sidetracked and started looking at spells that we can use as payoffs, and one thing that I realized is that 3 wizards in play will likely be the sweet spot to aim for with this deck. That way we can cast spells that cost 6 mana or less for free with Gandalf. 6 mana gives us plenty of powerful spells at our disposal without needing to rely on a large board of wizards that's much more easily disruptible. It also means that if a board wipe happens, then it's much more easy for us to rebuild and recover. Now something that I didn't think of earlier but realized as I was cooking was that extra combat spells will go very hard with Gandalf. Because we'll get to cast a free spell at the beginning of each combat, potentially chaining together many combats if we have enough spells or card draw. This sent me down a whole rabbit hole, and I am now looking very respectfully at Full Throttle. This also made me think of extra turn spells, but the commander brackets frown on chaining together extra turns, and honestly, if we're not doing that, extra combats are just better value. All that said, let's take a look at what we end up with. The key parts of this deck are first and foremost our wizards, which are the engine for our deck when paired with Gandalf. We do of course have our vegetables in removal and counter magic for protection, and we also have some coincidental ramp. But in reality this deck doesn't really need ramp, because we have ramp in the command zone. And there is very little benefit to ramping on turn 2 to get Gandalf out earlier, because in most games we'll want to be playing at least 2 wizards before we play him anyway. Our major payoff spells are spread across card draw and finishes. We have some mid-game card draw and some real bombs that can completely refill our hand. And our finishes, very much in line with my earlier ideas, are built around extra combats. To support these big flashy finishes and really kick things into overdrive, we have some spell copying to really go off, and some recursion in case we need to get a spell out of our graveyard, plus we have some tutors to fetch all the things we need. Let's deep dive and look at the key cards in each of these sections, starting with the wizards. Now functionally, our wizards are really just here to power out free spells, but I absolutely love it they all come with additional functionality and useful abilities. I focused on including wizards that cost 2 and 3 mana, so that we can have a good mana curve on turn 2 and 3, with a possible Gandalf on turn 4 for a free 6 mana spell. I've already mentioned Belmore and Adelies that can help buff our board to help us end the game. But drawing cards or gaining card advantage is my favorite thing to do in this game, and a bunch of our wizards help us do just that. Like Kitzer, Quain, Raph, Gandalf, Jorian, Joshua, Raoul, Plagon, Gale, Shantoto, Elfino, and Archmage Emeritus, all of which draw us cards and generate card advantage. The incremental card draw these wizards give us makes a huge difference to how this deck plays in the early to mid game. Now while I mentioned that ramp isn't important here, we do get a bunch of it anyway. Baral, Kaza, Ral, Sten, Alisei, Vivi, Kaikar, and the Emperor of Palamecia all give us ramp. An early Emperor can help us have counter magic a turn earlier, which can be very useful, and Vivi, well, can do Vivi things and make a lot of mana. We don't really want to have to use our wizards to block, so wizards that make us creatures that we can use to either create chump blockers or use on the offensive are very useful. To that end, Hermes, Kaikar, and Talrand can all make extra bodies for us. And a final special shout out for Alania Divergent Storm. Whilst they're on the more expensive side, copying spells is incredibly broken, so I kept this in for fun despite its 5 mana cost. Next, let's have a look at our payoffs. From a card draw perspective, we start with Pour Over the Pages, which can dig 3 cards into our deck and can untap 2 lands, which is actually pretty nice if we've played Gandalf on turn 4, and then we cast this, and then we can untap 2 lands to use for counter magic in case someone tries to play a board wipe. Frantic Surge is just a slightly worse version of this, but the untapped lands feel really good. Time Spiral is the best version of this, resetting everyone's graveyards and hands, and then drawing everyone's 7 cards, and then likely untapping most if not all of our lands. Pyretic Charge is instead a slightly worse wheel effect for us, but can also buff our entire board significantly, especially if it's copied, and I'll show you what I mean just a little bit later. Ugin's Insight also helps us dig really nicely, as it will usually be a free scry 4, draw 3, and the goal is to find out powerful spells with it. Recurring Insight is probably our second most powerful draw spell in the deck, easily drawing us 10 or more cards across 2 turns. We've also got Inspired Ultimatum, Overflowing Insight, and Seagate Restoration as the other big hand fillers, though I did wish they didn't cost 7 mana because that means we need 4 wizards in play, but they're worth having regardless. Now the real goal of the card draw is to A, draw us into our big powerful finishes, and B, to hopefully help us chain these big powerful finishes together. We've already talked about Pyretic Charge, but Surge to Victory is who Pyretic Charge wants to be when it grows up. We exile a spell from our graveyard, and then our creatures get power equal to that spell's mana value, which will usually be 6 or more. And what's more, whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player this turn, we get to cast that exile spell for free. So what if we exiled an Overflowing Insight? Well, we may remove a player and draw like 30 cards. Or better yet, what if we exiled a World at War? Well, now we may remove a player and take an extra 5 or more combats. I think you're likely seeing the vision. Pulling off a copied World at War or Savage Beating will have you unintentionally reenacting that Vince McMahon meme. We've got more extra combats where that came from. Cards like Savage Beating, Relentless Assault, Great Train Heist, Waves of Aggression, World at War, and of course Full Throttle all give us ways to get both extra damage and extra free spells in. Now the devil is always in the details, and there is an important thing you need to be aware of if you decide to build and pilot this deck when it comes to the wording on the extra combat spells. Only Savage Beating, World at War, and Great Train Heist can give you extra combats if cast in combat, which is obviously pretty important given our free spells mechanic that we get to cast in combat. Extra combat turns that specifically refer to this main phase won't give us extra combats if cast during combat. Now, extra turns wouldn't have this limitation, but that breaks the rules of the bracket system. Not a big issue, but still something you need to be aware of. Now, we don't want our high dopamine gameplay to be limited to single copies of a card. Repeated Reverberation and Complete the Circuit can both give us the ability to copy these massive game winners a bunch of times. And if that doesn't win you the game, following it up with Mnemonic Deluge to recast that spell from the graveyard for another 3 times almost certainly will. We have limited copies of these powerhouse cards in our deck, so Solve the Equation and Invent can help us find them. Last but not least, we have our vegetables, the lands, removal, and protection. Our protection is simply a bunch of good, cheap counterspells. And our mana base is mostly simple yet effective, though we do have some MDFCs that are worth calling out. Salinity Vision and Valakut Awakening are decent card draw spells if needed, and Sundering Eruption can stop people from blocking, which is a really big deal. Our wizards aren't the most beefy of attackers, so removing the blockers to allow us to get through damage is very important. And this extends to our board wipes, which are one-sided. This means they both can deal with problematic boards, but also more importantly can clear the way when we're looking to end the game. Raise the Palisade, Oza's Ruinous Blast, and Call Forth the Tempest all do a great job of this. I think right now this deck is in an interesting spot. I deliberately chose not to add game changers, partially because I don't think the deck needs them, but also so the deck can be played in bracket 2. Now I think this deck is plenty strong, and can do some really strong stuff, so I think it could probably hold its own during a bracket 3 game. But that said, it is very reliant on having Gandalf in play and resolving our big powerful spells. Our wizards are in no way scary unless we resolve multiple big powerful spells that give us multiple combats and immensely buff our board. The moment someone interacts with Gandalf, if we don't have a counterspell, or if they instead counter our big card advantage or game-winning spells, this deck will look and feel exactly like a bracket 2 deck. Which is fine if it's being piloted in bracket 2, but not if you're getting taken to Pound Town in bracket 3 instead. So I think this deck is in a great spot in bracket 2 with a caveat that you probably want to explain that you're going to be trying to get many extra combats so your weak-limbed and flimsy wizards can be a meaningful combat threat. So that's the deck in a nutshell, and hopefully you're as enthused as I am by the slinging of giant spells and many combats that this deck has in store for you. But how should you pilot it if you do decide to play it? The deck is in reality very straightforward to play until we get to around turn 5 or 6. From that point on, you definitely have to understand what your win lines are that you can use to win the game. Our first priority in the early game is to play wizards, and the next most important priority is to draw lots of cards. So our opening hand should be ideally 3 or more lands, a bunch of wizards, and a source of card draw. Protection and win conditions can come later. We're likely not going to be playing anything on turn 1 with this deck, which is absolutely fine in bracket 2. But hopefully, we're playing a wizard on turn 2 and 3 into Gandalf on turn 4. If you're worried about being targeted or having Gandalf removed, just play slower and play him on turn 5 or 6 with protection up, because it won't have a meaningfully negative impact on your game overall. The deck has plenty of gas to get you to the win after that point. From then on, you want to resolve a big card draw spell, like Overflowing Insight or Recurring Insight or Seagate Restoration. Seagate Restoration is the card draw goat, and resolving it once often sets us up for the win. We don't necessarily have to resolve one of these big card draw spells, but they make stringing powerful effects together much easier, and stringing powerful effects together is the goal of the deck. From there, across turns 5 to 8, we really just want to be crafting our hand and filling the board with more wizards. Do be careful though about overextending if you don't have counter magic to counter a board wipe. When it comes to ending the game, rather than incrementally dealing damage here and there, we want to build to one big turn. The most potent cards in our deck are Full Throttle, Surge to Victory, Complete the Circuit, Repeated Reverberation, and Mnemonic Deluge. Combining these in some fashion, with some form of evasion, like Raise the Palisade or a Chroma's Will, is how we get that Vince McMahon effect and how we typically want to win the game. Let's say we have a wide board of small wizards. What if we cast Complete the Circuit and then play Full Throttle? This will give us 6 combats, and each of those combats is going to give us a free spell from Gandalf. What if we now cast Surge to Victory? Well, now we quite likely have 40 plus power on the board and plenty of combats and more free spells to get the job done. And as I shared earlier, each of those creatures will cast the spell we exiled with Surge to Victory when they deal combat damage. So if we clear the way and we don't get blocked, the game is pretty much over. This process of making sure we do the math to figure out how our deck goes from a bunch of flimsy wizards to a game-ending threat is probably the most important cooking we have to do when we are making a deck. I'm busy working on another video about that topic soon, but needless to say, if you plan on playing this deck, figuring out which spells you pair together to get the job done whilst you're playing is very important. If we look at a different line, you could instead play Reverberation on a Savage Beating, giving you an extra combat and giving all of your creatures double strike. Then when you go to combat, you could play Pyretic Charge as a free spell. You will now have 2 combats with a board of big wizards, all of whom have double strike. That's a lot of damage and probably a game-ending threat. I will leave some of the joy of exploration to you, but I will show you practically how this comes together in a Goldfish attempt, and then we'll talk about some upgrades. I did a bunch of tests, and this is pretty par for the course. The opening hand here is pretty damn great. We have 3 lands, 2 wizards, a source of card draw, and a source of protection. I'd hope I don't have to use that Seagate Restoration as a land, but we have the option if we need it. Turn 1, I draw Raise the Palisade, and I play a land. It's a great spell to help us close out the game, but not a great turn 1 draw. Turn 2, I draw another land, which is great, and I play the Emperor. Emperor is good because it allows us to tap out all of our lands and have mana up for a counterspell. On turn 3, I draw another land, which I am again happy about, and I play a land and play Vivi. I forgot to tap my lands here, but just imagine that I did. On turn 4, I draw another land, which is still fine, and I tap out to play Gandalf. I do, however, not have a good spell to cast for free, which kinda sucks, but if I was under pressure, I could cast Raise the Palisade to clear the board. On turn 5, I draw another land, which is less of a banger, and without much to do, I pass. On turn 6, I thankfully draw a wizard in Adelise. I play it, and I can now cast the Inspired Ultimatum for free. I do so, and I draw a bunch of cards, including Overflowing Insight and Invent as a tutor. I also draw and play Kaza, which is a really good ramp source. Pretty solid draws all around, and all my spells now start building up Vivi as a mana engine. We're now getting to the point where things start to get spicy with this deck really quickly. On turn 7, I can't recall what I draw, but I go to combat and I play Seagate Restoration. I draw a whole bunch of cards, play out a Frantic Search, a Kaikar, and Alisei. This is a big setup turn for building out my board and filling up my hand. On turn 8, we do even more setup. I cast Invent to tutor up a full Throttle and a counterspell for protection, and I then go to combat playing Spell Twine to recast Seagate Restoration to draw even more cards. Because I am very greedy, I play Plagon to draw even more cards, and that leaves us with 24 cards in hand as we set up for the most broken turn on turn 9. On turn 9, we can now execute our Vince McMahon meme-inducing moment. After drawing, we have 25 cards in hand, with the most spicy ones being Raise the Palisade, World at War, Complete the Circuit, Full Throttle, Mnemonic Deluge, Overflowing Insight, and Pyretic Charge. For any Critical Role enjoyers that are watching this, it's a real Matt Mercer, how do you want to do this moment. We could convoke Complete the Circuit, and then cast Full Throttle, giving us 6 additional combats. Then when we go to combat, with our first free spell we could Raise the Palisade to remove all blockers. In our second of 7 combats, we can cast Pyretic Charge to discard our hand and give all of our creatures 17 extra power. If anyone survives, well, we would have 5 more combats. There are a host of other ways this turn can go, because we have things like World at War, and Mnemonic Deluge, and Overflowing Insight, but you get the idea. Now if you wanted to upgrade this deck, there are really 2 directions you can go. The first is swapping in a bunch of extra combat spells, because getting 6 extra turns with Time Stretch instead of 6 extra combats is a real drug. But to do this, you probably have to run the deck in bracket 4, and honestly I think the deck will struggle to keep up in bracket 4, so I just don't think it's worth it. Instead, I think any free spells and protection is where I would lean. Spells like Fierce Guardianship, Deflecting Swat, and Force of Will being the primary ones. You can also cut out some of the more expensive wizards like Alania and Alphino, and drop in ones that are lower on the curve. Simply hitting a wizard reliably on curve into a protected turn 4 or 5 Gandalf will do more for the deck than almost any other additions. A great low-cost wizard that I did consider but didn't include is Krark the Thumbless. I didn't include him because he is hit or miss, but the high rolls with this little guy will be absolutely game-breaking. In the deck list, there's also a whole bunch of cards in the sideboard that you can consider as other additions. Now if however you don't want the deck to be more powerful, you just want it to be cheaper, I've linked a budget list down below the like button that's almost as good for a lot less money. I'm sure this deck list isn't perfect as I haven't spent tons of time working on it, but I hope you've enjoyed my take on Gandalf Party Guest, and I hope you found my thinking useful. If you have any thoughts about how you would build Gandalf, or any great cards you think I've overlooked, yap at us in the comments. If you want to support my videos, smash up the like button, or subscribe so my next banger gets delivered directly into your eyeballs, or head over to my Patreon, and a big thank you to everyone that supports me over there, especially the Gigafroziers. If you want some personal tailored help, I make your decks better or simply cook up something for you, and you can find that over on Ko-fi, all of which you can find the links to down below the like button. And if you enjoyed this, you may like one of these videos about how I help other people build better decks. And a thank you for being here.